This is part 28 of my journey through the court system in the state of Connecticut over the last 10 years. So at the end of part 27, we were just about to go into the constitutional violations of the April 12th, 2022 hearing, which was between Matt Lodice and myself, and this was in front of Judge Maureen Price Borland, and it took place in the New Haven Superior Court in New Haven, Connecticut. If you haven't seen the 4/12/22 hearing, you can watch it on my YouTube channel, and I've also played it in an earlier video from this series. But I wanted to go into all the things that happened in that hearing that really stuck out. So during this hearing, Lodice perpetuated his systematic perjury by once again claiming that I just would refuse to take our daughter back at her time and that I just stopped taking her, contradicting the established reality that he had been using the obsolete Cumberland Farms exchange requirement as coercive leverage. His testimony that poor Angelina is, getting upset, crying all the time because she wasn't seeing her mom for like almost 3 weeks at one point, represents calculated emotional manipulation designed to support his false abandonment narrative. This testimony directly contradicts his own admissions from previous hearings that exchanges had been occurring successfully at the grandmother's house in Woodbridge for months, and that he had unilaterally demanded return to the gas station location specifically to create abandonment scenarios he could exploit in further court proceedings. The transcript reveals Lodice's continued systematic deception regarding his residence, as he provided 23 Lyman Street in New Britain as his current address while requesting to complete an updated appearance to reflect this supposedly new information. This testimony continues his pattern of residence fraud documented in previous hearings, where he systematically used false addresses to frustrate service of process and manipulate venue requirements. Connecticut General Statutes Section 46B-4 requires accurate residence information for proper venue determination, and Lodice's continued misrepresentation violates both perjury statutes and procedural requirements governing family court jurisdiction. Lodice's testimony reveals a sophisticated strategy to manipulate financial information while evading support obligations through custody manipulation. When confronted with his systematic non-payment of support since November of 2021, Lodice claimed that my circumstances of employment have changed drastically. And he said, I was making way more money when we agreed on that. By the way, what we had agreed on is $120 a week in child support, which was basically nothing. So him saying this contradicted evidence presented by me that he had started his business on April 16th, 2021, and that he had been making more money now than he had ever made in his entire life. His strategic admission that the $120 weekly support wasn't a court-ordered figure based off my income, but rather something we agreed on at the time, demonstrates his calculated attempt to minimize the legal significance of his non-payment while positioning himself for modification proceedings that would reduce his obligations. The transcript also reveals his systematic violation of the court-ordered right of first refusal requirements, with me testifying that I had filed the original contempt regarding strangers watching my child and his pattern of having strangers care for Angelina without offering me the required first opportunity. Lodice's failure to challenge these specific allegations while focusing on financial and custody manipulation demonstrates his consciousness of wrongdoing regarding these specific court order violations. His systematic pattern of placing Angelina with strangers rather than offering care to her mother violates both the court order and Connecticut statutes governing child welfare and parental rights. Judge Maureen Price Borland's most fundamental failure occurred through her systematic dismissal of documented court order violations without adequate investigation or enforcement action. When I presented evidence that Lodice had violated court orders regarding exchanges, right of first refusal, and support payments, Judge Price Borland responded by dismissing contempt motions and suggesting that reasonable people realize that circumstances change and make reasonable adjustments. This approach violates Connecticut General Statutes Section 46B-56 and federal constitutional requirements that courts enforce their own orders and protect fundamental parental rights through meaningful remedial action. The transcript reveals systematic gender-based discrimination through Judge Price Borland's disparate treatment of identical claims. When Lodice made unsubstantiated claims about my alleged non-compliance, Judge Price Borland accepted those assertions without requiring documentation while simultaneously dismissing my documented evidence of Lodice's systematic violations. Her statement telling both parties to grow up while I presented evidence of documented harassment and threats demonstrates the type of gender-based credibility discounting condemned in Green versus McElroy, which is a United States Supreme Court case from 1959. And this pattern violates equal protection principles under the 14th Amendment by applying different evidentiary standards based on gender rather than legal merit. Judge Price Borland's handling of Lodice's systematic support evasion violates both Connecticut support enforcement statutes and federal constitutional requirements for meaningful enforcement of court orders. Despite evidence that Lodice had not paid a single dollar of support since November of 2021, representing over $3,314 in arrears, the judge failed to impose immediate enforcement measures or sanctions. Her statement that until there's a modification, that's what you're paying, followed by acceptance of Lodice's excuse that I don't have it, demonstrates systematic enabling of contempt that violates Connecticut support enforcement statutes and constitutional requirements for meaningful remedial action. Judge Price Borland's decision to defer financial discovery requests until future hearings violates Connecticut discovery statutes and federal due process requirements that parties receive adequate information to protect their interests. My documented request for the last 3 years of his financial information based on evidence that Lodice had been making more money now than he ever has deserved immediate attention given the systematic support evasion and evidence of hidden income. Connecticut Practice Book Section 13-14 requires prompt disclosure of financial information in support proceedings, and the court's delay facilitates continued evasion while denying constitutional protections. Judge Price Borland's dismissal of evidence regarding Lodice's threatening behavior and coercive control tactics violates Connecticut Public Act number 21-78, also known as Jennifer's Law, which requires courts to consider evidence of psychological and economic coercion as domestic violence. My testimony about his threats to lower my child support or file for sole custody so that he doesn't have to pay child support anymore, and using that as a way to intimidate me, describes textbook coercive control that Connecticut law specifically identifies as domestic violence requiring judicial intervention. The court's failure to investigate or address these threats violates statutory mandates and constitutional requirements for protection of fundamental rights. The hearing violated fundamental due process requirements under Matthews versus Eldridge, which requires courts to consider the private interests at stake, the risk of erroneous deprivation, and governmental interests when fundamental rights are affected. My fundamental parental rights and support entitlements represent significant private interests that deserved heightened procedural protection, yet Judge Price Borland's proceeding maximized the risk of erroneous deprivation by dismissing documented violations without adequate investigation. The systematic dismissal of contempt motions, despite clear evidence of court order violations, denies the meaningful procedural protections required for fundamental rights determinations. The systematic disparate treatment documented throughout the hearing violates equal protection principles by providing fundamentally different procedural protections and substantive consideration based on gender and party status rather than legal merit. Follow for part 28 to hear the rest of why this 4/12/2022 hearing was a complete violation of my rights.